Hey everyone, Erick Stakelbeck here. Today on the Newscast, is Europe finally ready to stand up to the Turkish tyrant Recep Erdogan? It's about time. Get all the latest details coming up. Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. We have signs that European leaders are finally showing some backbone in their confrontation against Turkey's radical Islamist president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now, here on the Newscast, we've been calling for a tough response from Europe for months as Erdogan makes not only dangerous moves in the Middle East, but continues to direct threats against European nations, in particular France and Greece, over this dispute in the waters of the Eastern Mediterranean. Erdogan, needless to say, has treated his NATO allies in Europe very poorly, including over the past several years, threatening again and again to flood European countries with migrants and refugees from the Muslim world who would use Turkey as a transit point to enter Europe. It's almost like blackmail in a sense, and the European response, by and large, I'm sad to say, has mostly been silence and appeasement of Erdogan. If you appease a bully, he only grows stronger and he only grows more bold, and that's exactly what Erdogan has done. But I'm delighted to report that we have signs of life among European leaders, particularly in France, who are saying, hey, enough of this with Erdogan. We've got all the latest details for you. We're going to get into it in a minute. Before I do, I just want to encourage you to subscribe to the Watchman News channel right here on YouTube and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. Folks, we are bringing you the kind of cutting-edge, timely information that you just won't hear anywhere else, certainly not in the mainstream media. Okay, let's get into it. France and Turkey, a war of words rapidly escalating between the French President Emmanuel Macron and the Turkish tyrant Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Let's get into first how this all started. To do that, we have to rewind about 2 weeks to October 16th, 2020. On that fateful, sad, and tragic day, a French school teacher just outside of Paris was beheaded by a Chechen jihadist who was living in France, because the cause of it, according to the jihadist, were that this French teacher showed cartoons of Islam's Prophet Muhammad to his class. Now, obviously, this kind of thing, showing Muhammad cartoons over the years, has sent radical Islamists into a frenzy. This was no different, and sadly, this French school teacher was literally beheaded outside of the school in the street. A disgusting, evil, horrific act, and Emmanuel Macron, to his credit, responded pretty forcefully. Now, let me preface that by saying I've been critical of Macron for his stance towards Iran. France, when it comes to Iran, has tried desperately to preserve that disastrous Iran nuclear deal and to appease the Iranian regime and its proxies, which, look, that Iran deal is a complete disaster for France and the entire West. Macron doesn't seem to have grasped that yet. But in this case, I have to give credit where it's due. He stepped up right away and said enough is enough with radical Islamists in France. He's talking about the radical mosques, the radical imams and preachers in France, the jihadist network there. Folks, think about it. Over the past several years, and I wrote about this in my 2015 book, ISIS Exposed, France has borne the brunt of many terror attacks over the past several years. They have had a very strong Islamist and jihadist network. Thousands of French citizens traveled to Syria and Iraq during the height of that ISIS caliphate to join ISIS. Now I suspect that many are returning home and trickling home from Syria and Iraq back to European countries. That's a dangerous situation, to say the least. But I say all that to say that's the background. And Macron said, enough is enough. We cannot have parallel societies in the suburbs outside of Paris and in other places in France where Muslims are separate from the broader French society. We need to crack down on the extremists. Number one, not every Muslim in France, obviously, not your average peace-loving Muslim in France. He's talking in specific, clearly, about radical Islamists. He made that very clear for anyone to hear. We need to crack down on that, he said, number one. And number two, we need the Muslims who are living in France to assimilate into broader French society. I think these are very reasonable calls to action from Macron. And again, he made very clear who he was talking about in particular: jihadists, radical Islamists who do not want to assimilate into French society. He was very clear, pointing the finger at them. But Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, the Turkish tyrant, the Turkish rabble-rouser, I guess you would call him, he saw yet again in this latest incident in France, he saw an opportunity to present himself as the modern-day caliph and the leader of the Muslim world. So right away, he comes out over the past several days, and you would think, number one, hey, he would offer his condolences and say, look, my gosh, a French citizen was beheaded in cold blood by a terrorist in the streets of France. France, hey, we are so sorry for your loss. We stand against terror and jihadism of any kind. But we're talking about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of course, who is the leader, essentially, of the Turkish wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, who allowed ISIS fighters to transit through Turkey into Syria for years and years. So we pretty much got what we expected we would get from Erdogan, which was not a criticism of the terrorist who beheaded a French school teacher. No, a criticism of Emmanuel Macron for cracking down on radical Islamists on French soil. Erdogan compared Macron and French leaders to the Nazis, said this was similar to the Holocaust, and said, and I quote, that Macron needs mental treatment. He accused the French president, his NATO ally ostensibly. Turkey is still in NATO, although I call them NINO, NATO in name only, under Erdogan's rule. He calls a fellow NATO member, compares him to a Nazi, compares his policies to the Nazi policies in the Holocaust, and says he needs mental help. Now, usually, European leaders might have a little bit of a kerfuffle and might protest just a tad and then let it kind of slide. Macron, in this case, said no, no, no. And again, I have not been a fan. I've been a critic for his policies in the Middle East by and large. But in this case, got to give credit, Macron said no, no. Right away, he recalled the French ambassador to Ankara, brought him home, said, we're not having this. And this is unacceptable. Folks, frankly, I was pleasantly surprised. Finally, someone is standing up to Erdogan, standing up to the bully. What do you do with a bully? I learned this growing up in Philly at a very young age. If you appease the bully's going to grow stronger. You give him an inch and he takes a mile. And that's exactly what Erdogan has done in the face of European and Western appeasement. But now, hey, someone is finally standing up and saying, no, no, this is unacceptable. Your rhetoric, your threats are unacceptable. We are recalling our ambassador and we will not budge. Macron said, we're not going to budge. Erdogan is trying to paint this as a war between the West and Islam. He's trying to rally the Muslim world, fire them up, and again step forward with incendiary comments as the firebrand. He aspires to lead the Muslim world, be that modern-day caliph, revive the Turkish Ottoman Caliphate. We've talked about this many times here in the newscast. Check it out in our archives here on YouTube. So it's clear what he's doing. He sees an opening here again to project strength and power and tell the Muslim world, I'm your champion. We know that the prime ministers of Italy, the Netherlands, and Greece have all stood behind Macron on this and expressed support for France against Erdogan. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, also expressed her support. The Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte tweeted, Erdogan's words addressing Macron are unacceptable. For the freedom of speech and against extremism and radicalism, the Netherlands is standing with Macron. Very interesting. Italy's prime minister's tweeting out personal insults are unacceptable, basically. The EU wants to have a positive agenda with Turkey, but Turkey's just pushing that further away. Hey, it's a start, right? It's a start. These tweets are a start, and the rhetoric backing Macron is a start. You got to start somewhere. Couldn't get much worse than where it was with the appeasement of Erdogan, but I don't think he's going to back down, folks. The Turkish economy is struggling big time, and Erdogan, number one, wants to deflect attention from that, but number two, He is a driven ideologue. And to lead the revived Ottoman Caliphate that he dreams about, that he pines for, that means he must stand against the West. Just as the Ottoman Caliphate did in days past, he must stand against the West and all Western values and against Judeo-Christian Western civilization. That's what he believes he represents. So I don't anticipate him changing his behavior. I think sanctions, if the European Union considers sanctions against Turkey, maybe he would slightly change his tune. But for now, he's going to continue to boast, continue to make moves, in particular in the Middle East. Folks, let's just take a cursory glance at what he's doing right now in the region. We've told you, again, many times here on the news channel, we've warned about his rise in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya. He's in the middle of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And again, I mentioned earlier, in the Eastern Mediterranean, he's got a dispute with France, Greece, and Cyprus, all members of the EU. France and Greece, obviously, NATO members. Turkey, again, it's almost humorous to say it, but officially at least, they're still a NATO member. So he's got that dispute going there in the Eastern Mediterranean. This guy is everywhere right now. And at the same time, he's got troubles economically at home, yet he has tightened his grip over the past several years and pretty much leveled all opposition, cracked down on journalists. Anyone who has eyes to see can see exactly what he's doing. He is a budding tyrant in the world's most pivotal and strategic region, and he wants power. And he is very, very ambitious. So I don't see him backing down short of sanctions. I mean serious sanctions that would bite, and a unified front in Europe. Hey, Macron, to his credit, I've been critical again, but in this case, he's kind of leading the way against Erdogan. And as I just read to you, other European leaders are kind of lining up behind him. Refreshing to see. We'll see where this all goes. As I deliver this newscast to you, we're seeing in the Muslim world riots and protests against France and against Macron. They're burning Macron in effigy. They're calling him an Islamophobe, a racist, a bigot. We've seen this many times over the past several years. We're seeing it again in Gaza, in Bangladesh, in Iraq, and in Pakistan, a few other countries. We are seeing these protests. And Erdogan is fanning the flames. Just yesterday, he called for a boycott of all French goods. Talk about an escalation. Now French goods in Muslim countries are being taken off the shelves. So what is he going to do next? Because again, France is saying, we're drawing a line and we're not backing down. Folks, I hope they stick to it. I hope they do not budge. I hope they do not back down. It's time for a serious message to be sent to Erdogan that you're not going to get away with this anymore. Now, Israel has delivered that message to him time and time again. It's time for Europe to do it. And yes, I'd like to see the United States take a much firmer stance against Erdogan as well. We've seen some encouraging signs over the past 2 weeks out of the State Department criticizing Erdogan over what he's doing in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's a very positive step. But one of the things that really bothered me, which the world kind of just let pass, is when Erdogan said a few weeks ago, and look in our archives here in the news channel again, that Jerusalem is our city, talking about the Turks. To me, this was an open threat against an ally of the West, not a NATO member, Israel, obviously, but an ally of NATO, a close ally of NATO. Erdogan has consistently threatened Israel and talked about his desire for Muslims to seize Jerusalem. And it's been crickets chirping has been the response out of the West. All of this needs to change, and hopefully with what we see right now, with Macron and France, of all people, taking a stand, hopefully we will see a sea change in the posture of the West towards Erdogan, because it's about time, folks. Hey, thanks for joining us today on the Newscast. Before I go, again, I just want to encourage you to subscribe and click the notification bell. Check out our Watchman television show every week on TBN, the world's largest Christian television network, every Thursday night, 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, if you're here in the States. If not, you can check us out right here on YouTube. All of the episodes are posted to our YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, God bless you, and remember, never hold your peace.